The deep space station floated in the silence of orbit, its long arms stretched like the bones of an old machine. Around it, smaller craft came and went, carrying supplies, crew, and news from far-off fronts. That day, however, the entire station moved with a nervous energy. Everyone knew who was coming. The Queen. Her name had traveled through fleets and colonies, always carried with whispers. She was the ruler of a great alien empire, one that had stretched across hundreds of stars. She had led her warriors into battles that had shaken planets and torn moons apart. To hear her name was to think of power, fire, and fear. And now she was coming here not as a victor but as a wounded leader whose fleet had been shattered. The carrier ship limped into orbit, its hull burned and scarred. It looked less like a vessel and more like a graveyard dragging itself through space. Small shuttles hurried to meet it, guiding the huge vessel to dock with the station. Inside the docking bay, soldiers stood in stiff lines, their hands gripping rifles they prayed they would not have to use. Medical crews stood ready with stretchers and machines. Engineers checked the air seals again and again. No one wanted the Queen to arrive, but no one dared show it. When the doors opened, the air seemed to freeze. The Queen was carried inside, her body covered with strange silver wrappings that clung to her skin. Her breathing was shallow, each breath sounding like the hiss of a broken pipe. Her tall form seemed smaller than the stories told, but the weight of her presence was still heavy. Even wounded, she radiated something that made hearts pound. Some crew members lowered their eyes, others stepped back as though afraid even to look. Every corner of the station buzzed with rumors. Some said she would die within hours. Others said she only pretended to be weak, that once her strength returned she would strike down every human in the room. Fear spread quickly, moving faster than the machines could carry her to the medical wing. On the lower decks of the station, far from the noise, a man named Tom worked in his workshop. He was a mechanic, and he liked nothing more than the steady sound of tools and machines. His small workshop was filled with half-repaired engines, piles of wires, and broken drones waiting for his touch. Unlike the rest of the station, Tom did not care about queens, rulers, or battles. He cared about silence. Silence meant no one was yelling orders, no alarms were ringing, and no machines were failing. When news reached him that the alien queen had arrived, Tom only shrugged. "Not my problem," he muttered as he tightened a bolt on an old generator. To him, a machine breaking down was important. A queen, wounded or not, was just noise from above. But on the higher decks, silence of another kind spread. The Queen was placed in a large chamber filled with strange lights and human-built medical systems. The machines hummed, but many of them were old and faulty. Sparks jumped from one of the panels. The doctors hesitated. They were skilled, but none wanted to be the one to touch the Queen's chamber when she still had the strength to open her eyes. "She is too dangerous," one whispered. "If the machines fail, she will die," another said, though his hands shook as he reached forward and then pulled back. Fear made them useless. The machines kept failing, and the Queen's breathing grew weaker. A commander in charge looked around the room and clenched his jaw. "Bring the mechanic," he ordered. "The human who fixes everything. He will do it." Minutes later, guards stormed into Tom's workshop. He looked up from his work with a frown. "What is it now?" "You're needed," one guard said sharply. "I'm busy," Tom replied, pointing to the half-open engine beside him. The guards didn't listen. They pulled him away from his bench and dragged him down the long halls toward the medical wing. Tom grumbled the whole way, muttering about people never leaving him in peace. When he entered the chamber, all eyes turned to him. Soldiers, doctors, and officers looked at the mechanic as though he was walking into the mouth of a beast. On the bed of silver light lay the Queen, her tall form still and her chest rising with slow, ragged breaths. Her eyes were closed, but the weight of her presence pressed on the room like a heavy hand. Tom rubbed his forehead and stepped closer to the failing machine. "It's just wires," he said under his breath. He bent over the panel, ignoring the stares of the others. Sparks snapped at his fingers as he adjusted connections, twisted cables, and reset circuits. Behind him, a faint sound stirred. The Queen's eyes opened, glowing dimly. For the first time since her arrival, her gaze locked onto someone, not a soldier, not a doctor, not a commander. It was the human mechanic, working with calm hands, unafraid of her. Tom did not look up. He was too busy with the wires. All he wanted was for the machine to stop making that irritating buzzing sound. The room held its breath. The Queen had opened her eyes. And she was watching the only human who dared act as though she were nothing more than a patient in need of a quiet machine. The hum of the machines filled the chamber, but it was a broken hum, uneven and sharp. Sparks jumped from the cables that Tom tried to mend, and every snap of light made the soldiers flinch. The doctors stayed close to the walls, whispering to one another, their eyes moving from the wounded Queen to the human mechanic who worked beside her bed. Tom did not notice their fear. He only saw the mess of wires before him, tangled and scorched from poor repairs. His hands moved with habit, twisting, cutting, and setting connections in place. The noise of the machine annoyed him more than the Queen's heavy breathing. He wanted it to stop whining. One of the officers stepped forward nervously. "Be careful, mechanic," he said. "If she wakes and sees you touching her chamber." Tom lifted his head just enough to give the officer a flat look. "Do you want the machine working or not?" he asked. His tone was plain, not rude, just tired. The officer closed his mouth and stepped back. The Queen shifted on the bed. Her tall frame twitched, and her hand, thin but strong, moved against the silver wrappings that covered her wounds. A low sound came from her throat, a sound like a growl and a sigh combined. The doctors stiffened. The soldiers raised their rifles halfway before lowering them again. None dared to make the first move. Tom did not look up. He pulled a burnt fuse from its slot, tossed it on the floor, and reached for another. He muttered to himself as though the machine was an old friend that had disappointed him. Always the same. People push too hard, then complain when it breaks. The Queen's eyes opened again. They glowed faintly, not with fire but with exhaustion. She turned her head just enough to watch the human bent over her life support. Unlike the others, he had not frozen. He had not backed away. His hands moved steady, his breathing even, his focus on the machine rather than her. The silence stretched until it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Then, in a voice broken by weakness, the Queen spoke in her own tongue. The sound rolled through the air, low and sharp, filled with meaning no one else understood. The doctors looked at each other nervously. The soldiers shifted uneasily. Tom, however, only grunted. "Quiet," he said, as though speaking to the machine instead of her. He twisted a wire into place and tightened a panel. The humming steadied. The Queen blinked slowly. She did not understand his words, but his tone reached her. She had heard fear in the voices of countless enemies, worship in the voices of her own people, but never had she heard a voice that simply asked for silence. The commander stepped closer, his face pale. "Mechanic," he whispered. "She looks at you. She listens to you. Be careful. If she thinks you mock her, she will end you the moment she gains her strength." Tom sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Machines don't care about queens," he said. "And I don't care about thrones. I care about getting this thing to stop sparking." He turned back to the machine, tightened the last bolt, and shut the panel. The chamber light steadied, and the Queen's breathing grew smoother, the sound less harsh. A faint color returned to her pale face. The doctors relaxed a little, though none dared move closer. The Queen closed her eyes again, but not in weakness. She closed them with thought, as if listening to something inside herself. For the first time since she was carried aboard, the noise of her own pain eased. And the one who had given her that ease was not a doctor or a soldier, but a human mechanic who wanted nothing but quiet. The commander waved for Tom to step back. "You have done enough," he said quickly. "Leave before she wakes fully. We will take it from here." Tom stood, dusting his hands on his jumpsuit. "It'll fail again," he said plainly. "That system's been patched too many times. I'll have to check it tomorrow." The commander's eyes widened. "Tomorrow? Are you mad? Do you want to put yourself before her again?" Tom shrugged. "If the machine breaks, she dies. If she dies, the whole station might burn with her. I'd rather fix it now and not hear the alarms later." The room went still at his words. No one had spoken of her death so directly. The Queen, though her eyes were shut, stirred as if she had heard. Tom walked out before anyone could stop him, his boots clanging against the floor. Behind him, whispers rose. Soldiers whispered that the mechanic had no sense of fear. Doctors whispered that perhaps his simple mind gave him courage. Officers whispered that maybe the Queen herself had spared him. But in her chamber, the Queen lay still, her thoughts no longer on her wounds alone. She thought of the human's calm voice, the sound of his hands working without hesitation, the way he spoke as if her life was simply another machine to repair. In all her years of war and command, no one had treated her so. The station returned to its busy rhythm, but a new undercurrent moved among the crew. Fear remained, yet curiosity stirred with it. Why had the Queen looked at the mechanic and not destroyed him with a glance? Why had she allowed his touch when she had pushed away countless others? And in the quiet workshop below, Tom wiped grease from his hands and muttered, "Finally." Some silence. The next morning, the station buzzed with more rumors. People spoke in hushed voices as they passed each other in the halls. Some swore the Queen had opened her eyes and fixed her gaze only on the mechanic. Others said she had spoken words in her alien tongue, words that carried weight even though no one understood them. A few whispered that perhaps the Queen had already chosen him for some unknown purpose. Tom ignored all of it. He returned to his workshop, sat at his cluttered bench, and worked on a drone that had refused to fly in a straight line. He preferred the soft click of tools and the hum of engines over the chatter of frightened people. Yet before he could finish tightening a bolt, 2 guards appeared at his door again. "She needs you," one of them said. Tom sighed heavily. "Machines always need me," he muttered, standing up and grabbing his toolkit. He followed without argument, though he walked slower than the guards wished. The medical chamber was quieter than before. The soldiers still stood by the walls, but their rifles were lowered. The doctors moved more carefully, keeping their distance but not frozen in fear. The Queen lay in the same bed, but her breathing was stronger. The machines hummed smoothly, though a faint flicker in one panel showed Tom exactly why he had been called. As he bent to check the panel, he felt a weight on him. He looked up and saw her eyes open, watching him. The Queen's gaze was sharp, yet not threatening. She studied him the way he studied a broken engine, curious, cautious, seeking to understand. "Mechanic," the commander whispered from across the room. "Do not stare at her. Do your work and leave." Tom grunted. "I'm not staring. She's staring at me." The Queen's lips moved, and a soft sound came out, broken by the strain in her voice. The words were foreign, the rhythm different from human speech. Tom shook his head. "I don't know what you're saying." She frowned, then tried again, this time slower. A single human word slipped from her tongue, rough and uneven. "Work." The room stiffened. The doctors looked at one another with wide eyes. The commander whispered, "She learns our words." Tom kept his eyes on the panel. "Yes," he said simply. "Work." He tightened a loose cable and checked the fuse. The machine steadied, the flicker vanishing. "Better." The Queen repeated, "Better." The word sounded strange in her voice, heavy with an accent, but clear enough to understand. Tom blinked at her, then shrugged. "You're learning fast." The Queen tilted her head slightly. No one else dared laugh, but there was something in her gaze that almost looked like amusement. She closed her eyes briefly, as though resting, then opened them again to keep watching him. Tom returned to his tools, muttering to himself. Machines don't fix themselves. People always push them too far. The Queen listened, not understanding every word, but catching his tone. It was calm, steady, without fear. She repeated softly, "Machines." This time, Tom did look up. "Yes. Machines. That's what I fix." He tapped the panel with the back of his wrench. "Not queens. Not thrones. Just this." She blinked, as if the word just puzzled her. Her eyes stayed on him, thoughtful. The commander finally stepped forward, his voice low. "Mechanic, finish your work and go. You do not understand how dangerous this is. Every moment you stay near her is a risk." Tom wiped his hands on his jumpsuit. "Everything's a risk. Broken wires can burn down a whole deck if ignored. Better to fix it than hide from it." The Queen's gaze sharpened. She understood little of the words, but she understood the sound of them, the sound of someone who treated danger as simple work. For her, that was new. For centuries, people had bowed, begged, or fled. No one had spoken around her as if she was only another task on a long list. When Tom packed his tools, the Queen made another attempt at speech. Her lips shaped the word slowly, uncertain. "Quiet." Tom froze, then gave a small nod. "Yes. Quiet. That's what I want." The soldiers stared in disbelief. The Queen had spoken in their tongue, choosing a word that matched the mechanic's own desire. Tom gave the machine one last check, then turned to leave. As he walked out, the Queen's eyes followed him until the doors closed. That night, as the station settled into uneasy rest, the Queen remained awake in her chamber. She repeated the words she had learned: work. Better. Machines. Quiet. Each one carried the echo of the human's voice. She did not know why she remembered them, only that they felt different from the endless words of fear and war she had heard all her life. In the workshop below, Tom sat with another broken drone, finally enjoying the silence. Yet in the back of his mind, he thought of her voice repeating his words, and it made the silence feel less empty. The station was alive with whispers. In every hallway, in every dining area, in every corner where two workers met, the same subject returned: the Queen and the mechanic. "Did you hear?" She spoke a human word, one technician murmured. "They say she only opens her eyes when he enters the room," a guard added. "And yesterday, she repeated what he said." "She learns from him," a young doctor said with unease. The whispers spread faster than orders. Some said Tom had cast a spell. Others claimed the Queen had chosen him as her servant. A few believed the mechanic was already lost, that the Queen was pulling his mind apart slowly, piece by piece. Fear colored every version of the story. Tom, however, cared little for rumors. He sat in his workshop surrounded by tools and scraps, fixing what others broke. The hum of the machine soothed him. Yet every few hours, a knock came at his door. A guard or a doctor would appear and tell him the same thing: the Queen's chamber needed him again. At first, he resisted. "I'm no nurse," he grumbled. But in the end, he went. The machines around her were fragile and old, patched too many times. They failed often, and Tom was the only one steady enough to keep them alive. Each time he returned, she was waiting. Her body still weak, her skin pale, but her eyes sharp. She watched him as he worked, her gaze following every movement. At first, she only listened, repeating simple words like work or quiet. But slowly, she began to form short questions in broken human speech. One morning, while Tom adjusted a cooling unit, she spoke. "Why, fear." Tom raised an eyebrow but did not look up. "Because fear makes bad work," he answered. "Shaking hands can't fix wires." She frowned at the words but nodded slowly. "Others, fear," she said haltingly. "They can if they want," Tom muttered. "Doesn't change the machine." Her lips curved, not quite a smile but something close. She repeated, "Doesn't change." The doctors who stood nearby exchanged nervous glances. To them, this was unnatural. The Queen, ruler of a warlike people, learning and repeating human words from a mechanic, it was a story no one could have imagined. The rumors grew darker. Some feared the Queen was manipulating him, testing him to find weakness in the humans. Others whispered she might bind herself to him, using him as her voice when she regained her strength. The commander of the station heard all of it and grew uneasy. He confronted Tom after one of his visits. "Do you know what you are doing?" the commander asked sternly. Tom shrugged. "Fixing machines. She speaks to you. She learns from you. She might be bending you to her will." "I don't feel bent," Tom replied. "I feel tired. I want to go back to my workshop." The commander clenched his jaw. He wanted to forbid the mechanic from returning, but the truth was cruel. Without Tom, the Queen's machines would fail. Without the Queen alive, the fragile balance of power could shatter. Their enemies would smell weakness and strike. The commander waved him away, but unease remained in his eyes. Meanwhile, the Queen continued to practice words. At night, when the doctors thought she slept, she whispered them to herself: "Work. Quiet. Doesn't change. Machines." The sound of those words carried her through the pain. For the first time, she felt her thoughts slowing, not with anger, but with curiosity. She remembered battlefields filled with screams. She remembered warriors who bowed and enemies who begged. But never had she met someone who simply wanted silence. The thought puzzled her, yet it also soothed her. On the lower decks, Tom noticed the difference as well. He found himself speaking more when he worked near her, explaining what he was doing even though she barely understood. "This wire is too thin," he said once. "It burns out faster. Needs replacing." The Queen repeated, "Thin. Burns." Her eyes followed his fingers, learning with each small movement. The doctors watched this with wide eyes. "She learns through him," one whispered. "Not from books. Not from us. From him." The rumor spread further. Soon, the entire station knew the Queen spoke human words, and that she learned them from the mechanic. Some were fascinated, others frightened. But everyone agreed on one thing: something was changing between them. One night, as Tom left the chamber, a group of workers stopped him in the hall. Their faces were tense. "What is she telling you?" one asked sharply. "Nothing," Tom replied flatly. "You're hiding something." "Why else would she look at you that way?" another demanded. Tom adjusted the strap of his toolkit. "She looks at me because I fix her machines. Same reason you look at me when your engines break." The workers stepped back, muttering to themselves, unsatisfied with his answer. Tom walked away, glad to return to the peace of his workshop. But even there, the silence was not the same. He found himself hearing her voice in his memory, repeating his words with her heavy accent. He told himself it did not matter, yet he felt the quiet of his workshop less empty than before. The Queen, too, lay in her chamber, whispering the mechanic's words into the night, as if testing their weight. She did not understand why she repeated them, only that they gave her strength in a way she had never known before. And while the station still feared her, she began to wonder if perhaps one human, the one who wanted nothing but silence, might see her as something more than a queen. The station floated in uneasy calm, but beneath its steel walls, fear never rested. The Queen's wound slowly healed, her voice grew stronger, and her gaze sharper. Every day, Tom was called back to her chamber to repair another failing system. And every day, she learned more words, building her human speech piece by piece. "Wire," she said once, pointing. Tom nodded. "Yes. Wire. Bad wire. Needs fixing." "Fixing," she repeated. But while she learned, the rest of the station lived with dread. Many officers whispered that she was dangerous even in her weakness. Some begged the commander to send her away, to hide her or abandon her. Others argued that without her, their enemies would see an opening and attack. Their fears proved true sooner than expected. One morning, alarms wailed through the halls. Red lights flashed, and the sound of rushing footsteps filled the air. Tom, half asleep in his workshop, was pulled awake by the echo of sirens. He stepped into the hallway and saw soldiers running toward the command deck. "What now?" he muttered. He had hoped for a quiet day. The news spread quickly. Enemy scouts had been sighted near the outer rim of the system. The same enemy fleet that had wounded the Queen before had discovered her trail. If they knew she rested here, they would strike without mercy. The commander gathered his officers in the control room. "If they come here in force, the station cannot hold," he said grimly. "Our defenses are old. Our guns too few. If the Queen falls into their hands, all is lost." A doctor spoke in fear. "We should not keep her here. She brings war upon us." Another officer shook his head. "If we move her, they will hunt her down and destroy us anyway. At least here, we have some protection." Their arguments filled the room, but none offered hope. In her chamber, the Queen listened as whispers of the threat reached her. She sat upright for the first time, her tall frame still thin but her eyes bright with returning strength. The doctors tried to calm her, but she pushed their hands away. "Danger," she said in halting human words. "They come." Tom arrived just then, toolkit in hand, expecting another broken panel. He stopped short when he saw her sitting upright, her sharp gaze fixed on him. "Danger," she repeated. "They come." Tom sighed. "So I've heard. Alarms are loud enough." The doctors gave him worried looks. "Mechanic, tell her she must remain calm. If she pushes herself too soon, her wounds will reopen." Tom shook his head and crouched by the humming machine. Calm or not, this thing's still overheating. He tightened a valve, checked the wiring, then spoke without looking at her. "If they're coming, the station's in trouble. Our defenses barely work on a good day." The Queen tilted her head. "You, fight." Tom laughed dryly. "Me? No, I fix machines. Others fight." She studied him for a long moment. Then she said slowly, "If you fix, we live." Tom paused, then gave a small nod. "That's the idea." The commander entered the chamber, his face lined with stress. He pointed at Tom. "You should not be here. When the enemy arrives, she may turn on us all. You do not understand, mechanic. She will use you, then destroy you." Tom wiped his hands on his jumpsuit. "If her machines fail, she dies. If she dies, they win. Seems simple to me." The commander clenched his fists. "Do you not fear her?" "I fear broken systems more," Tom replied flatly. The Queen's eyes gleamed at his answer. She turned to the commander and spoke in rough human words. "He stays." The commander froze. The Queen had spoken clearly, her voice steady, her meaning impossible to mistake. She had chosen. Word spread quickly across the station. Soldiers whispered in disbelief. Workers muttered in worry. The Queen had claimed the mechanic, and the mechanic did not resist. As the hours passed, scouts reported more ships approaching. The enemy fleet was indeed on its way. Fear gripped the station like a vice. Many crew members begged to evacuate. Others prepared weapons with shaking hands. Tom, however, returned to his workshop. He gathered spare parts, old wires, and tools, muttering to himself. Engines break. Shields break. Guns break. Always something. But as he worked, he realized something had shifted. At first, he had repaired the Queen's systems only because no one else dared. Then he had done it because he disliked alarms and chaos. Now, however, he found himself thinking not of silence alone but of her voice, her questions, the way she repeated his words. He wanted her to live. Back in her chamber, the Queen sat taller, her strength growing. She listened to the distant alarms and thought of the mechanic's steady hands. She had ruled armies, destroyed fleets, and crushed rulers, but none of them had ever spoken to her without fear. None had ever looked at her as if she were only a task to be finished. And now, as the enemy fleet drew closer, she felt something she had never known before, not only the weight of battle, but the strange desire to fight not for empire, not for conquest, but for the survival of the station where the human mechanic worked in silence. The station shook with activity. Sirens wailed, soldiers ran through the halls, and the sound of boots striking metal echoed like drums. Everyone prepared for the enemy fleet that was now only hours away. Fear spread in every direction. Some crew members packed their things in secret, hoping to escape before the attack. Others tightened their armor and gripped their weapons with trembling hands. In the middle of this storm of panic, Tom carried a heavy box of spare parts to the Queen's chamber. He moved slowly, muttering under his breath about people never taking care of their machines until it was too late. His face was calm, though the station shook with tension around him. When he entered the chamber, the Queen was no longer lying down. She sat tall on the edge of her bed, her silver wrappings loosened, her wounds glowing faintly as they healed. The doctors looked at her in awe and fear, too frightened to tell her to rest. Her eyes turned immediately toward Tom. "You, come," she said in rough but steady human words. Tom set his box down with a grunt. "Yeah. Brought parts. Your systems won't hold during a fight unless I fix them again." The Queen studied his face carefully, then nodded. "Fix. Then, fight." Tom looked at her, confused. "I don't fight." She raised her hand and pointed to the ceiling, where the sound of alarms pulsed. "Fight, here. I'll fight." Tom sighed. "Not me. I'll be busy keeping things from breaking." Her lips curved slightly. It wasn't a full smile, but it was the closest thing her face had shown since arriving. She seemed to understand him in a way the others did not. The commander entered the chamber, his voice sharp with stress. "We are preparing the defenses. Enemy ships will arrive within hours. We must decide whether to move the Queen or risk holding the line." Before Tom could speak, the Queen stood. Her tall form seemed unsteady, but her presence filled the room like a storm. She lifted her hand and spoke with clear effort. "I stay." The commander froze. His throat worked, but no words came. The soldiers behind him shifted uneasily. The Queen continued, her voice gaining strength. "If run, all die. If stay, fight. Win." The chamber fell silent. For the first time, she had spoken a full sentence in human tongue, and its meaning left no doubt. The commander turned to Tom. "Did you teach her these words?" Tom shook his head. "She learns because she listens. Not my doing." The commander stared at both of them, then rubbed his face in frustration. "Very well. If she fights, maybe we have a chance." As the hours passed, the station prepared for battle. Tom worked tirelessly, moving from system to system. He patched shields, reinforced weak panels, and replaced broken wires. The Queen followed him sometimes, watching silently. She did not speak much, but when she did, her words were always simple and direct. When Tom tightened the last bolt on a shield generator, he muttered, "That should hold for a while." "Hold," she repeated, nodding. Her presence beside him made the soldiers nervous, yet none dared stop her. They had begun to understand she had chosen the mechanic, and the mechanic had chosen to stay. As the last preparations finished, a strange quiet settled over the station. The alarm still pulsed faintly, but the rush of footsteps slowed. Soldiers took their posts. Doctors stood ready in the medical wing. The stars outside the windows burned silently, waiting. Tom sat in his workshop for a brief moment, wiping grease from his hands. The quiet was heavy, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence before a storm. He leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he realized he was not waiting only for the machines to fail. He was waiting for the fight that would decide whether anyone survived. In her chamber, the Queen stood tall, her strength returning hour by hour. She looked at the metal walls around her and thought of her lost fleet, her fallen warriors. She remembered the screams of battle, the weight of command. Yet her thoughts did not stay on those memories. Instead, she thought of the mechanic's steady hands and his simple words, "Machines don't fix themselves, silence is better than alarms." She whispered softly, practicing the human words. "Silence, before storm." When the call came from the commander that the enemy fleet had entered range, the station seemed to hold its breath. Soldiers tightened their grips on weapons. Gunners stared at their screens. The commander raised his voice across the comms. "All stations ready. This is it." Tom rose from his bench, grabbed his toolkit, and muttered, "Noisy again." He walked to the Queen's side. She looked at him, her eyes calm, her voice low. "Together," she said. Tom gave a small nod. "Together. You fight. I fix." She straightened, her figure strong despite her wounds. "Fight. Fix. Win." The two of them stood side by side as the first enemy signals appeared on the screens. Outside, the stars filled with hostile shapes. Inside, silence lingered for one final breath before the storm began. The first shot shook the station. Metal groaned, lights flickered, and the hum of the shields rose to a painful pitch. Soldiers braced themselves while gunners fired back, sending streaks of light across the dark sky. The enemy fleet had arrived in full force, their ships blotting out the stars. In the command deck, the commander shouted orders, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Shields up. Weapons online. Hold your positions." Down below, Tom tightened his grip on his toolkit and ran toward the generator room. Sparks burst from a broken panel, and the smell of smoke filled the air. He coughed and muttered, "Always the same. First fight, first system breaks." He knelt and worked quickly, twisting wires and replacing fuses as the station shook again. Beside him, the Queen stood tall. She did not flinch when explosions echoed through the halls. Her eyes burned with strength, and her voice carried across the room. "Stand fight," she commanded the soldiers nearby. They obeyed, though their hands shook less when she spoke. Tom kept working. "If the shields fail, we're all dust," he said. The Queen looked down at him and placed one hand on the humming machine. "Fix. I protect." True to her words, when enemy fire struck and shook the walls, she raised her hand. Strange energy flickered from her, mixing with the station's defenses. The shields glowed brighter, holding against blasts that should have torn them apart. Soldiers gasped at the sight, but Tom only muttered, "Good. Keep it steady while I finish." Hours passed like minutes. The battle raged outside, but inside, it was a cycle of noise and silence. Noise when the station shook, silence when Tom's hands moved and the Queen's voice calmed the soldiers. Together, they kept the fragile station alive. At one point, the shields flickered dangerously. The commander's voice crackled over the comms. "Shields are collapsing. We cannot hold." Tom wiped sweat from his brow. "Not if I can help it." He pulled out a long cable and connected it to a bypass system. Sparks stung his hands, but he kept working. The Queen placed her hand over the panel, channeling her strength into the failing machine. Energy surged, the hum deepened, and the shields flared back to life. The soldiers cheered. The commander's voice cracked with relief. "Shields restored. Hold your fire." Tom leaned back, his chest heaving. That was too close. The Queen's voice was calm but strong. "Close, but hold." Slowly, the tide of battle turned. With the Queen guiding the defenses and Tom repairing every system that faltered, the station endured longer than anyone expected. The enemy fleet pressed hard, but one by one, their ships broke apart under combined fire. Finally, after hours of chaos, the remaining enemy vessels pulled back, retreating into the dark void. The silence that followed felt heavy, almost unreal. No alarms, no blasts, no shouting, only the soft hum of machines still running. Tom sat on the floor, his jumpsuit burned and stained with grease. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. Finally. Silence. The Queen lowered herself to sit beside him. Her tall frame cast a long shadow, but her presence no longer felt heavy with fear. Instead, it carried calm. She looked at him and said slowly, "Silence, because fight done." Tom gave a small nod. "Yes. Fight's done." Around them, soldiers and doctors began to whisper again, but this time the whispers were different. No longer filled with fear, they carried awe. They had seen the Queen fight not against them, but for them. They had seen the mechanic keep her alive when all others hesitated. The story spread through the station like fire, but it was not a tale of fear anymore, it was a tale of survival. Later, in the command deck, the commander gave his report to the crew. "We survived because of two. The Queen, who stood with us, and the mechanic, who refused to let our systems fail. Remember this day. Without them, we would be gone." The crew saluted, their voices carrying respect instead of dread. For the first time, the Queen's name was spoken without trembling. Back in the quiet workshop, Tom sat at his bench, tools scattered before him. He sighed in relief at the silence that finally returned. The Queen entered, her steps soft for someone so tall and powerful. She looked around at the cluttered space and then at him. "You choose silence," she said. Tom nodded. "Always." She tilted her head, thoughtful. "I choose fight. But, with you, silence not empty. Silence, strong." Tom looked at her, surprised. For a long moment, neither spoke. The workshop filled with the hum of an old engine, steady and calm. Then Tom gave a faint smile. "If that's what you think, I won't argue." The Queen lowered her head slightly, not in weakness but in respect. "Mechanic, gave me silence. And I, give you strength." From that day on, the station no longer feared her the same way. The wounded alien Queen was no longer just a shadow of terror, and the human mechanic was no longer just a man who wanted quiet. Together, they had changed each other and the people around them. For Tom, silence would always matter. But now, it was not only the silence of machines working properly. It was the silence of trust, the silence of battles survived, the silence shared between two unlikely allies who had found something rare in the vast noise of the universe.